after the destruction of the Greek pantheon. This is the narrative psychological displacement, where the physical architecture of the world Kratos once knew, the sprawling temples and divine hierarchies, has been replaced by the vastness of the void. Within the blood-stained sand and the infinite horizon, the former ghost of Sparta witnesses the final inefficacy of his suicide. The lore of this era is the lore of the unwanted life. Its purpose was the existential imprisonment of the deicidal warrior. The history of the fallen god is the history of the fugitive from fate, where survival is not a blessing, but a punishment imposed by a cosmos that refuses to let its most violent subject rest. This is the tragedy of the permanent scars, proving that exile is a prison that travels with the inmate. The lore of the failed suicide and the persistence of the blades provides the philosophical foundation for this chapter's despair. Following the events of God of War 3, Kratos plunged the blade of Olympus into his own chest to release hope to mankind and end his suffering. The lore suggests that the blades of chaos are sentient parasites. Their purpose was the eternal branding of the servant. By reappearing every time Kratos attempts to discard them, the blades proved that the contract with Ares transmuted into a law of physics, showing that sin is a material that cannot be destroyed or abandoned. This reveals the haunted purpose of the fallen god's journey. The warrior must carry the tools of his genocide as his only possessions. This was the era of the chains of guilt. This shows that the history of Kratos is a history of the attachment, which binds the man to the monster. The physical environment of the shores of the Mediterranean provides insight into the archaeological melancholy of the fall. This is a landscape of rubble stripped of its gods, representing the silence after the scream. The lore of the decimated homeland explains that its purpose was the spatial manifestation of absolute consequence. By walking through the ruins of the civilization he toppled, Kratos proved that revenge is a desert, showing that power without restraint leaves the king with nothing but dust to rule. This reveals the cynical purpose of the Exodus. The slayer must flee the evidence of his crime to avoid the reflection of his soul. This was the era of the ash-stained skin. This shows that the history of the land is a history of the absence, which mourns the order broken by the ghost. The relationship between the nightmare and the insomnia of the god represents the neurological torture within the fall. Kratos cannot sleep without witnessing the faces of those he murdered, his wife, his child, and his father, representing the internalization of the Furies. The lore suggests that the nightmare is a divine prosecution. Its purpose was the prevention of the subjective erasure of history. By denying the god the respite of unconsciousness, the universe ensured that the blood stayed fresh in the mind, showing that memory is the final weapon of the fallen. This reveals the punitive purpose of his exhaustion. The body may wander, but the spirit is crucified on the timeline. This was the era of the sleepless god. The history of the nightmare is the history of the witness, which refuses to blink. Furthermore, the lore of the discarded wrappings and the exposure of the brand represents the futility of disguise within the fall. Kratos attempts to hide the scarred flesh where the chains were bolted to his arms, representing his desire to become anonymous. The lore suggests that the scar is a cosmic landmark. Its purpose was the mark of the unchangeable identity. By tearing through every bandage and cloth, the blades proved that the past requires visibility, showing that truth will bleed through the fabric of the new life. This reveals the exposing purpose of the curse. The god cannot wear the mask of a mortal while his skin screams of Olympus. This was the era of the raw flesh. This shows that the history of the branding is a history of the inevitability, which strips the man naked before his fate. The relationship between the solitary trek and the rejection of society represents the misanthropic insulation within the fall. Kratos avoids the living fearing that his presence brings only calamity, representing his recognition of himself as a walking apocalypse. The lore suggests that the solitude is a sacrificial quarantine. Its purpose was the protection of the world from the god of war. By choosing the wilderness over the village, Kratos attempted to break the chain of destruction, showing that isolation is the only altruism left to a killer. This reveals the hermetic purpose of the travel. The ghost must walk alone, so the small can live in ignorance. This was the era of the silent path. The lore of the voice of the old world and the call of the new represents the linguistic transition within the narrative. As Kratos leaves the Greek sands and enters strange lands, the language of the gods changes, but the tone of the suffering remains the same, proving that pain is a universal dialect. The lore suggests that the voice is a phantom of authority. Its purpose was the haunting of the modern by the ancient. By hearing the echoes of Athena in the wind, Kratos proved that distance does not grant absolution, showing that the mind carries the geography of the gallows. This reveals the auditory purpose of the transition. The god must learn a new world while stuck in the last sentence of the old one. The act concludes with the silent observation of Kratos at the border, casting the blades into a chasm only to find them tied to his bedroll at dawn. Realizing that he is not moving toward a future, but dragging a corpse through the present. The purpose of the curse of the immortal exile lore was to be the universal exposure of the weight of identity. It shows that war is eternal within the warrior. The player realizes that Kratos is a monument that refuses to topple. The rise of the fallen god is the final movement of the exile lore, proving that in the world of God of War, survival is not a victory. It is a repetitive endurance that is hardened by the will to deny the blade that won't leave. The legacy of Kratos in this chapter is the horror of the psychological displacement. We realize that freedom was a bloody mirage and death was a tether that the fates used to anchor the slayer to the remains of his own wrath. The purpose of the workshop of the exile was to inventory the guilt, and the fall was the immortality of the scars. As the blades glint in the dark and the sand fills the prints of the ghost, hearing the clinking of the chains echoing through the valley, they understand that the history of Kratos is the history of the echo, an echo that shouts of the past but leaves the future to wither in the cold of the unending road. The next chapter marks the geographic intersection of two distinct divine realms. This is the narrative ecological alienation, where the physical architecture of the scorched Mediterranean gives way to the monolithic grandeur of the Egyptian desert. Within the shifting dunes and the merciless noon, Kratos encounters the silence of the Nile, a world that feels ancient even to a god of Olympus. The lore of this era is the lore of the cultural collision. Its purpose was the testing of the ghost of Sparta against an indifferent pantheon. The history of the Egyptian mirage is the history of the unwanted guest, where Kratos discovers that his Greek curse carries no currency in a land of ibis-headed spirits. This is the tragedy of the universal outcast, proving that home is a memory and the world is a labyrinth that stretches to the ends of the horizon. The lore of the desert as the crucible of sanity provides the environmental foundation for this chapter's isolation. Kratos walks into the great sand sea not to find a destination, but to drown his identity in the heat, representing his desire for physical evaporation. The lore suggests that the Sahara is a sanitizer of the soul. Its purpose was the stripping of the divine ego through attrition. By forcing the god to endure thirst and exhaustion, the land attempted to reduce the slayer to a mortal, showing that nature is the only force that does not fear the blades. This reveals the humiliating purpose of the sands. The ghost must submit to the sun to understand how small his vengeance truly was. This was the era of the scorched footsteps. This shows that the history of the desert is a history of the erasure, which swallows the god in the gold. The physical environment of the hidden oasis provides insight into the deceptive sanctuary of the fall. Deep within the wastes, Kratos finds a lush pocket of water and shade, but it is inhabited by a strange old man and a talking ibis, representing the infiltration of the divine into the mortal refuge. The lore of the ancient sage explains that its purpose was the intellectual ambush of the fugitive. The man speaks in riddles that mirror Kratos' own internal war, proving that there is no place on earth where the truth cannot find you. This reveals the inescapable purpose of the oasis. The gods of Egypt were watching the butcher of Greece long before he arrived. This was the era of the Thoth beast's prophecy. This shows that the history of the oasis is a history of the trap, which lures the exile into a conversation with his destiny. The relationship between Thoth and the recording of the sin represents the cynical observation within the fall. The ibis-headed being observes Kratos without malice, but with terrifying objectivity, representing the god of wisdom's role as the scribe of the universe. The lore suggests that Thoth is the mirror of the unforgiven. Its purpose was the documentation of the anomaly. By telling Kratos that his path is already written in the stars of Egypt, the beast proved that Kratos is not a man, but a fixed point of chaos, showing that identity is a sentence passed by the cosmos. This reveals the clinical purpose of the meeting. The god learns that he is a specimen being studied by a higher order. This was the era of the eternal ink. The history of the Thoth beast is the history of the record, which refuses to let the slayer disappear. Furthermore, the lore of the hallucination and the return of the blades represents the psychological relapse within the fall. In the heat of the noon, Kratos sees the ghost of Athena rising from the dunes, representing the stalking shadow of his Greek ancestry. The lore suggests that the hallucination is a manifestation of the unconscious guilt. Its purpose was the sabotage of the quiet life. By appearing in the strange land, Athena proved that the gods of Greece live inside Kratos' skull, showing that geography cannot kill the god that lives in the blood. This reveals the parasitic purpose of the mirage. The queen will never allow her general to forget the war. This was the era of the shimmering treason. This shows that the history of the mirage is a history of the anchor, which pulls the mind back to the fire. The relationship between the village of the damned and the first contact represents the tragic inevitability within the fall. Kratos encounters a settlement of Egyptians who suffer under a supernatural storm, representing his first opportunity to help since the fall. The lore suggests that the village is a test of the compassion. Its purpose was the demonstration of the god of war's toxic touch. Despite his attempt to ignore them, Kratos is drawn into their plight, showing that violence is the only gift he has left to give to the mortal. This reveals the fatal purpose of the first contact. The slayer brings the night to the day just by being present. This was the era of the sand-choked prayer. The lore of the choice to stay or the choice to run represents the existential pivot within the narrative. As the Thoth beast urges Kratos to accept his fate as a god and defend the land, Kratos fights the impulse to care, proving that his greatest enemy is his own potential for good. The lore suggests that the choice is a broken compass. Its purpose was the conflict between the man and the myth. By choosing to flee into the deep desert rather than fight, Kratos attempted to defy the story written for him, showing that the will can reject the script but cannot stop the ink from flowing. This reveals the cowardly purpose of his flight. The hero runs from the call to avoid the echo of the warrior. The act concludes with the silent observation of Kratos deep in the waste, realizing that the sun of Egypt is as cold as the moon of Sparta when your soul is empty. The purpose of the Egyptian mirage lore was to be the universal exposure of the futility of the escape. It shows that destiny is relentless. The player realizes that Egypt is not a resting place, but a new battlefield for an old war. The rise of the crocodile, the chaos, is the final movement of the mirage lore, proving that in the world of God of War, peace is not a place, it is a mirage that dissolves as soon as you reach for the water. The legacy of the desert in this chapter is the horror of the ecological alienation. We realize that distance was a dust-filled delusion and purpose was a tether that Thoth used to anchor the exile to the divine mandate. The purpose of the workshop of the mirage was to prove the inevitability, and the fall was the failure of the solitude. As the sand covers the sun and the ibis watches from the dunes, hearing the scream of the wind echoing through the empty oasis, they understand that the history of Egypt is the history of the trap, a trap that offers the void but leaves the god to starve in the presence of the stars. The third chapter in our 8-part chronicle of fallen god documents the violent re-entry of the warrior into the physical realm. This is the narrative instinctual relapse, where the physical architecture of the Egyptian wetlands, the reeds of the Nile, and the mud-clogged deltas becomes the arena for a primordial struggle. Within the crushing jaws of the chaos beast and the spray of bloody water, Kratos is forced to confront the lie of his pacifism. The lore of this era is the lore of the Predator's resurrection. Its purpose was the shattering of the mortal pretense through physical extremity. The history of the Beast of the Nile is the history of the forced engagement, where the ghost of Sparta discovers that amnesty is denied to those who carry the scent of deicide. This is the tragedy of the necessary monster, proving that peace is a luxury that nature will tear from the hands of the guilty. The lore of the giant crocodile and the aspect of chaos provides the biological foundation for this chapter's aggression. Emerging from the depths of the river, this titan-sized abomination represents the raw and unthinking hostility of the Egyptian wilds. The lore suggests that the crocodile is a primal mirror. Its purpose was the tactical engagement of the god of war's dormant reflexes. By attacking without reason or warning, the beast proved that the world does not care about Kratos' spiritual journey, showing that existence is a combat and survival is the only law. This reveals the instigating purpose of the beast's arrival. The gods of the Nile used the monster to provoke the Spartan into revealing his true face. This was the era of the churning silt. This shows that the history of the crocodile is a history of the catalyst, which turns the victim back into the executioner. The physical environment of the Nile Delta provides insight into the visceral vulnerability of the fall. This is a treacherous maze of currents and hidden depths, where Kratos' heavy Greek frame is disadvantaged by the element of water. The lore of the submerged battlefield explains that its purpose was the stripping of the tactical advantage. By fighting in an environment that favors the beast, Kratos was forced to abandon his mortal restraint and access the infinite strength of his godhood, proving that adversity is the only key that unlocks the divine potential. This reveals the testing purpose of the wetlands. The earth must drown the man to force the god to swim. This was the era of the blood-stained reeds. This shows that the history of the Delta is a history of the desperation, which makes rage the only oxygen left in the lungs. The relationship between the Spartan rage and the failure of the vow represents the psychological rupture within the fall. As the crocodile crushes his ribs, Kratos succumbs to the fire in his blood, representing the return of the very power he vowed to bury. The lore suggests that the rage is an involuntary inheritance. Its purpose was the proof of the indelible nature of the soul. By erupting in a golden aura of violence, Kratos proved that Kratos and the god of war are one and the same, showing that willpower is powerless against biology. This reveals the humiliating purpose of the awakening. The man realizes he is a slave to his own greatness. This was the era of the Crimson Vision, The history of the rage is the history of the relapse, which burns the new self to feed the old flame. Furthermore, the lore of the reluctance to use the blades represents the moral stagnation within the fall. Even as he pummels the beast with bare hands, Kratos refuses to draw the blades of chaos, representing his hate-filled attachment to the symbols of his bondage. The lore suggests that the blades are the final temptation. Their purpose was the demonstration of the warrior's dependency. By winning the fight without them, yet realizing the effort nearly killed him, Kratos proved that his refusal to be a god is a suicidal vanity, showing that efficiency requires the acceptance of the curse. This reveals the cruel purpose of the hand-to-hand combat. The fingers must break before the palm will grasp the hilt. This was the era of the broken knuckles. The relationship between the Thoth beast's observation and the divine commentary represents the judgment of the ancient within the fall. The ibis watches the slaughter from a distance, proving that the gods of Egypt approve of the violence as long as it serves their land. The lore suggests that the witness is a cosmic auditor. Its purpose was the validation of the Spartans' utility. This reveals the manipulative purpose of the divine presence. The pantheon doesn't want a hermit, they want an apex protector. This was the era of the silent judgment. This shows that the history of the observation is a history of the audition, which turns a murder into a resume. The lore of the death of the beast and the satiation of the earth represents the sacrificial offering within the narrative. As Kratos rips the jaws of the crocodile asunder, the Nile drinks the blood of the monster, proving that order is maintained through cyclical killing. The lore suggests that the corpse is a landmark of return. Its purpose was the declaration of the god's presence to the world. By leaving the colossal remains to rot in the sun, Kratos inadvertently signed his name on the landscape, showing that the ghost leaves a trail of bodies even when he tries to walk softly. This reveals the ironic purpose of the victory. The slayer won the battle, but lost the anonymity. The act concludes with the silent observation of Kratos standing over the carcass, heaving with breath and coated in foul slime, realizing that the smell of victory is exactly the same in Egypt as it was in Thebes. The purpose of the Beast of the Nile lore was to be the universal exposure of the futility of the moral vow. It shows that nature demands the monster. The player realizes that Kratos is a weapon that cannot blunt itself. The rise of the rage is the final movement of the beast lore, proving that in the world of God of War, identity is not a decision, it is a reflex that is hardened by the will of the universe to keep the god of war bloody. The legacy of the crocodile in this chapter is the horror of the instinctual relapse. We realize that pacifism was a fragile pretense and survival was a tether that the chaos used to anchor the Spartan to the reality of his own violence. The purpose of the workshop of the beast was to destroy the illusion of change, and the fall was the surrender to the impulse. As the water turns red and the ibis flies away into the twilight, hearing the snap of the bone echoing through the marsh, they understand that the history of Kratos is the history of the predator, a predator that kills the threat but leaves the man to mourn the death of his mercy. The fourth chapter in our chronicle centers on the psychological siege of the protagonist's mind. This is the narrative intellectual enslavement, where the Egyptian ruins become the backdrop for a spiritual interrogation. Within the shifting sands, Kratos is confronted by the spectral remains of Athena, the goddess of wisdom who transcended her mortal form to become a cynical voice. The lore of this era is the lore of the unrelenting tether. Its purpose was the systematic dismantling of the exile's autonomy. The history of the shadow of Athena is the history of the divine gaslighting, where the ghost of Sparta discovers that distance is irrelevant to a goddess who occupies the geography of his subconscious. This is the tragedy of the internalized master, proving that sovereignty is a myth and the mind is a cell where the warden never sleeps. The lore of the transcended Athena and the logic of fate provides the theological foundation for this chapter's despair. No longer a physical being, this version of Athena exists as a psychological weight, representing the cold nature of the Greek legacy. The lore suggests that Athena is the ghost of responsibility. Its purpose was the forced acceptance of the god of war's cosmic utility. By appearing in Egypt and mocking Kratos' attempt to be human, she proved that history requires him to be a weapon, showing that identity is a sentence passed by the heavens. This reveals the oppressive purpose of her haunting. The goddess wants to kill the man to preserve the icon. This shows that the history of Athena is a history of the possession, which turns the soul into a puppet of the pantheon. The physical environment of the crumbling temple of the sun provides insight into the theological displacement of the fall. Amidst the decaying pillars of Ra, Kratos is forced to listen to the voice of his old master. The lore of the ruined sanctuary explains that its purpose was the spatial manifestation of the failure of a new beginning. By corrupting a foreign holy site with the arguments of Olympus, Athena proved that there is no soil untainted by the blood of the past. This reveals the nihilistic purpose of the haunting's location. The exile realizes that his grave will be dug in the same shadow regardless of the longitude. This shows that the history of the temple is a history of the intrusion, which shatters the sanctuary to expose the sin. The relationship between the argument and the rejection of the hero's journey represents the moral stagnation within the fall. Athena urges Kratos to accept his call to action in Egypt not out of kindness, but out of systemic necessity. The lore suggests that the hero's path is a gilded leash. Its purpose was the rebranding of the murderer as a savior. By offering him a purpose, Athena attempted to validate the blades of chaos, showing that redemption is a trap used to recruit the guilty for divine statecraft. This reveals the manipulative purpose of the goddess's rhetoric. The queen sells glory to ensure the chain never breaks. The history of the argument is the history of the resistance, which refuses the mask of the hero. Furthermore, the lore of the silence of the Egyptian gods represents the complicit observation within the fall. While Athena torments Kratos, the gods of Egypt stand by, proving that the divinity of the world shares a common interest in controlling the chaos. The lore suggests that the silence is a celestial treaty. Its purpose was the demonstration of the universal nature of godhood. By allowing the Greek ghost to rule the Spartan's mind, the Egyptian pantheon acknowledged that a god is a god and a slave is a slave. This reveals the collaborative purpose of the observation. The world is a joint prison managed by different wardens. This was the era of the mute horizons. The relationship between the denial of absolution and the weight of the blades represents the ontological prison within the fall. Athena reminds Kratos that the blades return because they are him, representing the inseparability of the tool from the hand. The lore suggests that the blades are the physical manifestation of the unending debt. Their purpose was the final cancellation of the hope for forgiveness. By binding the steel to his soul, Athena proved that Kratos does not deserve peace, showing that the universe only forgives the insignificant. This reveals the cruel purpose of the haunting. The goddess feeds on the god's self-loathing to keep the fire burning. The lore of the choice of the void represents the spiritual mutiny within the narrative. Kratos responds to the goddess with silence and fury, choosing to wander deeper into the madness of the desert rather than obey, proving that his hate for the gods is greater than his love for purpose. The lore suggests that the rejection is a Pyrrhic victory. Its purpose was the preservation of the self at the cost of sanity. By walking away from the wisdom, Kratos confirmed his status as a fallen entity, showing that the will can defy the light but cannot avoid the dark. This reveals the vengeful purpose of his isolation. The god would rather rot in nothingness than bloom in the service of the heavens. The act concludes with the silent observation of Kratos alone in the night, realizing he has traded the physical chains of Greece for the ethereal noose of the mind. The purpose of the Shadow of Athena lore was to be the universal exposure of the futility of intellectual escape. The player realizes that Kratos is being broken not by war, but by words. The rise of the internal conflict is the final movement of the Shadow lore, proving that in the world of God of War, freedom is not a departure. It is a silence hardened by the will to ignore the goddess who knows your name. The legacy of Athena in this chapter is the horror of the intellectual enslavement. We realize that wisdom was a bloody instrument and guidance was a tether used to anchor the slayer to the reality of his own bondage. The purpose of the workshop of the shadow was to deconstruct hope, and the fall was the corruption of solitude. As the green glow fades and the ghost lifts his head to face the sun, hearing the rattle of the thought echoing through the empty skull, they understand that the history of Athena is the history of the warden. A warden that watches the world burn but leaves the god to choke in the smoke of his own past. The 5th chapter in our chronicle marks the ethical reawakening of the exile. This is the narrative protective relapse, where the Egyptian landscape shifts from a personal purgatory to a theater of shared suffering. Within the mud-brick walls of a desperate settlement, Kratos is forced to witness the divine cruelty of the Egyptian wilderness directed at those who cannot defend themselves. The lore of this era is the lore of the reluctant guardian. Its purpose was the reignition of the Spartans' empathy through external brutality. The history of the siege is the history of the inescapable conscience, where the ghost of Sparta discovers that he cannot truly fall as a god if he still feels as a man. This is the tragedy of the compassionate killer, proving that apathy is a mask that shatters the moment a child cries out in the dark. The lore of the hippopotamus god and the avatar of chaos provides the biological foundation for this chapter's conflict. Rising from the marshlands, this second chaos beast, a towering bipedal hippopotamus, represents the indiscriminate violence of the Nile's ancient spirits. The lore suggests that this beast is a force of nature's malice. Its purpose was the tactical demonstration of the vulnerability of the weak. Unlike the crocodile, which hunted Kratos for sport, this creature targets the village, proving that the world's darkness seeks to consume the innocent. This reveals the provocative purpose of the beast. It was sent to drag the Spartan out of his self-pity by threatening the lives of those he tried to ignore. This shows that the history of the hippopotamus is a history of the ultimatum, which demands that the god either serve or watch the world burn. The physical environment of the burning granary provides insight into the material fragility of the fall. As the beast tears through the village's food supply, the architecture of survival is reduced to ash, representing the transience of mortal effort. The lore of the scorched earth explains that its purpose was the spatial manifestation of the end of the world for the common man. By standing amidst the smoke of a stranger's home, Kratos is reminded of the smallness of the lives he once destroyed in Greece, proving that destruction is a universal language. This reveals the reflective purpose of the siege. The exile sees the victims of his past in the faces of the present. This shows that the history of the village is a history of the mirror, which reflects the Spartans' own gory legacy. The relationship between the mortal plea and the cracking of the apathy represents the psychological pivot within the fall. An old woman and a child approach Kratos not as a god, but as a strong man, begging for a mercy he believes he no longer possesses. The lore suggests that the plea is a spiritual anchor. Its purpose was the forced interruption of Kratos' internal monologue. By being seen as a protector, Kratos is forced to confront the lie of his isolation, showing that humanity is a burden that cannot be discarded in the desert. This reveals the redemptive purpose of the encounter. The ghost realizes that helping is the only way to drown the screams of his nightmares. This was the era of the trembling hand. Furthermore, the lore of the refusal of the blades in the heat of battle represents the moral stagnation within the fall. Even as the hippopotamus god prepares to crush the villagers, Kratos continues to fight with bare hands and found objects, representing his suicidal commitment to rejecting his Greek identity. The lore suggests that this refusal is a vow of mutilation. Its purpose was the demonstration of the cost of pure will. By choosing to sustain physical injury rather than draw the blades of chaos, Kratos attempts to prove to Athena that he is free, showing that stubbornness is the final fortress of the damned. This reveals the masochistic purpose of the struggle, the slayer would rather break his own bones than touch the steel of his sins. The relationship between the beast's supernatural strength and the divine limit represents the physical reality of the fall. This creature possesses a hide that defies mortal weapons and a strength that rivals the Titans, proving that the gods of Egypt are testing the limits of Kratos' unarmed godhood. The lore suggests that the beast is a kinetic filter. Its purpose was to exhaust the Spartans' mortal pretense. This reveals the exposing purpose of the combat. The universe is stripping Kratos of his arrogance by showing him that mercy without power is merely suicide. This shows that the history of the fight is a history of the threshold, which pushes the god to the edge of his self-restraint. The lore of the first roar of the Protector represents the vocal transition within the narrative. For the first time in the series, Kratos' rage is directed not at a father or a king, but at a bully, marking his transition from a vengeful son to a stern guardian. The lore suggests that this roar is the voice of the justified wrath. Its purpose was the validation of the power when used for the weak. By shielding the village with his body, Kratos proves that strength can be sacred if the intent is sacrificial. This reveals the transformative purpose of the roar. The monster discovers that his growl can sound like hope to those in terror. The act concludes with the silent observation of Kratos grappling with the massive beast at the village gates, realizing that his exile has ended and his duty has begun. The purpose of the siege of the village lore was to be the universal exposure of the impossibility of true neutrality. The player realizes that Kratos cannot hide from the world because the world will always find a reason for him to kill. The rise of the Guardian is the final movement of the siege lore, proving that in the world of God of War, heroism is not a choice, it is a relapse into responsibility that is hardened by the will to protect what is small. The legacy of the hippopotamus in this chapter is the horror of the protective relapse. We realize that peace was a selfish delusion and apathy was a tether that the exile used to anchor his own comfort to the ruins of his mind. The purpose of the workshop of the siege was to destroy the hermit, and the fall was the birth of the duty. As the villagers watch from the shadows and the god bleeds for strangers, hearing the crash of the timber echoing through the plains, they understand that the history of Kratos is the history of the shield, a shield that absorbs the blow but leaves the man to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. The sixth chapter in our chronicle records the ontological reunion of the warrior and his weapons. This is the narrative tragic acceptance, where the physical architecture of Kratos' resistance, his refusal to touch the Greek steel, is finally demolished by the overwhelming pressure of the Egyptian beasts. Within the heat of the final stand and the flickering shadows of the village, Kratos realizes that his bare hands are insufficient to stop the cosmic tide. The lore of this era is the lore of the rearmed god. Its purpose was the forced reconciliation with the destructive identity. The history of the acceptance is the history of the surrender to the self, where the ghost of Sparta stops running from the blades and starts owning the chaos. This is the tragedy of the necessary evil, proving that identity is a weapon that returns to the hand that forged it. The lore of the call of the blades and the breaking of the vow provides the spiritual foundation for this chapter's climax. As the hippopotamus god and the crocodile unite to crush the last of the village, Kratos reaches for the wrappings on his back, representing the death of his denial. The lore suggests that the blades of chaos are living regret. Their purpose was the physical manifestation of the warrior's inescapable utility. By unsheathing them in Egypt, Kratos proved that his Greek curse is the only medicine for Egyptian terror, showing that violence is a universal language that transcends borders. This reveals the inevitability purpose of the return. The god must embrace the monster to save the mortal. This was the era of the scorched hilt. The physical environment of the Night of the Twin Beasts provides insight into the atmospheric dread of the fall. The wetlands are illuminated by the fires of the blades, representing the invasion of Greek hell into the Egyptian night. The lore of the burning delta explains that its purpose was the spatial manifestation of the end of the fugitive's peace. By painting the Nile red with the sparks of Olympus, Kratos proved that there is no darkness deep enough to hide the fire of his origin. This reveals the exposing purpose of the battle. The exile is revealed as a sun that burns everything it touches. This shows that the history of the delta is a history of the conflagration, which turns the refuge into a pyre. The relationship between the execution of the shadows and the precision of the god represents the martial reawakening within the fall. Unlike the clumsy brawl of the previous chapters, the use of the blades restores Kratos' divine grace, allowing him to dismember the chaos beasts with surgical fury. The lore suggests that the blades are the extension of the divine will. Their purpose was the demonstration of the superiority of the god of war over wild chaos. By carving the symbols of his wrath into the Egyptian flesh, Kratos proved that he is the apex predator of the multiverse, showing that skill is the final law of the divine. This reveals the mastery purpose of the slaughter. The slayer accepts that he is perfected only through steel. Furthermore, the lore of the searing of the chains and the rebranding represents the physical permanence within the fall. As the chains wrap around his forearms once more, the skin sizzles and smokes, representing the permanent bond between the man and the tool. The lore suggests that this is a marriage of pain. Its purpose was the final erasure of the mortal facade. By allowing the blades to mark him again, Kratos proved that he has given up on the hope of clean hands, showing that freedom is the acceptance of your prison. This reveals the binding purpose of the rearming. The warrior wears his sin as armor to fight the world. This was the era of the smoking scar. The relationship between the Thoth beast's silence and the acceptance of the role represents the diplomatic conclusion of the fall. The ibis nods as Kratos sheds the blood of the beasts, proving that the gods of Egypt have succeeded in recruiting their guardian. The lore suggests that the Thoth beast is a cosmic recruiter. Its purpose was the manipulation of the hero's conscience. This reveals the cynical purpose of the divine silence. The pantheon waited for the hero to break so they could use his remains. This shows that the history of the recruitment is a history of the subjugation, which turns exile into employment. The lore of the death of the twin beasts and the satiation of the chaos represents the ecological stabilization within the narrative. As the crocodile and the hippopotamus fall, the storm subsides and the Nile stills, proving that the violence of the god of war is the only force capable of quelling the primal chaos. The lore suggests that the double kill is a sacrament of order. Its purpose was the validation of the bloody peace. By standing amidst the mountains of meat, Kratos proved that the world requires a monster to keep the other monsters at bay. This reveals the functional purpose of his rage. The god realizes that his hatred is the foundation of the mortal's safety. The act concludes with the silent observation of Kratos holding the glowing blades, looking at his own reflection in the bloody water, and realizing that the man who entered Egypt is dead, and only the god remains. The purpose of the acceptance of the blades lore was to be the universal exposure of the futility of escaping one's nature. The player realizes that Kratos' choice was an illusion crafted by the universe. The rise of the rearmed ghost is the final movement of the acceptance lore, proving that in the world of God of War, destiny is not a path you walk, it is a chain that pulls you home. The legacy of the blades in this chapter is the horror of the ontological reunion. We realize that exile was a gilded dream, and will was a tether that the blades used to anchor the slayer to the reality of his eternal war. The purpose of the workshop of the acceptance was to solder the bond, and the fall was the execution of the hope. As the green eyes of the ibis fade and the god cleans his steel with the hem of his wraps, hearing the rattle of the metal echoing through the still air, they understand that the history of Kratos is the history of the blade, a blade that cuts the enemy but leaves the hand to bleed in the cold of the divine mandate. The 7th chapter in our chronicle documents the continental transition of the ghost of Sparta. This is the narrative geographic disillusionment, where the physical architecture of Egypt, the Great Pyramids and Nile deltas, is abandoned for the vague promise of the unknown. Within the aftermath of the bloodbath and the fading heat of the desert, Kratos realizes that even though he saved the village, he cannot dwell in the shadow of their gratitude. The lore of this era is the lore of the perpetual nomad. Its purpose was the final rejection of the Egyptian pantheon's offer. The history of the departure is the history of the refusal of sovereignty, where Kratos discovers that a throne is merely a pillar for another prison. This is the tragedy of the rootless god, proving that peace is not found in victory, but in the distance put between the self and the divine. The lore of the offer of the Thoth beast and the temptation of local lordship provides the political foundation for this chapter's exit. Following the slaughter of the Chaos beasts, the ibis-headed spirit suggests that Kratos could rule or protect this land as a respected deity, representing the lure of stability. The lore suggests that this offer was a sanctified trap. Its purpose was the integration of the Greek anomaly into the Egyptian order. By refusing to become their guardian, Kratos proved that he no longer seeks authority, showing that power is a poison he has already drank to excess. This reveals the defiant purpose of his departure. The god would rather starve in the wild than feast as a slave of the local pulpit. The physical environment of the Northern Gate provides insight into the threshold of the unknown within the fall. As Kratos reaches the borderlands, where the sand begins to cool and the air becomes sharp, the landscape changes its language, representing the exit from the sphere of Thoth and Ra. The lore of the cold horizon explains that its purpose was the spatial manifestation of the end of the Mediterranean era. By stepping out of the warmth, Kratos proved that his internal winter is seeking its external counterpart, showing that misery seeks the climate that matches its soul. This reveals the gravitational purpose of the migration. The exile is drawn to the frost to numb the fire of his arms. This shows that the history of the gate is a history of the severing, which cuts the god from the sun. The relationship between the final vision of Athena and the silence of the mind represents the psychological fortification within the fall. As he leaves, the spectral queen jeers at his futility, but Kratos meets her with total silence, representing the first true victory over his past. The lore suggests that this silence is the armor of the indifferent. Its purpose was the neutralization of the divine influence. By ignoring her wisdom, Kratos proved that she only has power if he listens, showing that memory is a ghost that starves when it is denied an audience. This reveals the liberating purpose of the walk. The slayer learns to burden the goddess with irrelevance. This was the era of the mute rebel. Furthermore, the lore of the pack and the remnants of the Greek soil represents the material burden within the fall. Inside his traveler's bag, Kratos carries nothing but essentials and the blades, representing the weight of a life stripped to its violent core. The lore suggests that these possessions are the artifacts of the unchangeable. Their purpose was the demonstration of the gods' refusal to accumulate. By leaving the gifts of the villagers behind, Kratos proved that he wants to owe the world nothing, showing that freedom is the ability to leave without looking back. This reveals the minimalist purpose of the pack. The warrior reduces his existence to an edge and a path. The relationship between the migration of the soul and the loss of time represents the chronological disorientation within the fall. The days blur into months as Kratos crosses the bridge of the world, walking through vast plains and rising mountains, representing the scale of his avoidance. The lore suggests that the walk is a physical purgatory. Its purpose was the exhaustion of the divine vitality. By choosing to walk rather than fly or step through portals, Kratos proved that he wants to feel every mile of his exile, showing that penance is a measurement of distance. This reveals the ascetic purpose of the trek. The god uses the earth to tire the monster. This was the era of the endless stride. The lore of the first scent of pine and the end of the sand represents the sensory rebirth within the narrative. As the dry aroma of dust is replaced by the damp scent of wood and sap, Kratos enters a realm that does not know his name, proving that the world is larger than Olympus. The lore suggests that the pine is a herald of the Norse. Its purpose was the introduction of a new mythological logic. By breathing the mist of the north, Kratos proved that he has successfully left the sun gods behind, showing that the universe has basements where even Athena cannot see. This reveals the hopeful purpose of the numbness. The exile seeks a grave in the snow, but finds a forest. The act concludes with the silent observation of Kratos standing at the base of a great mountain range capped with white, realizing that the heat of Greece and Egypt has finally died in his skin. The purpose of the departure from Egypt lore was to be the universal exposure of the necessity of the clean break. The player realizes that Kratos is not searching for a home, but for a silence deep enough to hold him. The rise of the Northern Traveler is the final movement of the departure lore, proving that in the world of God of War, exile is not a destination, it is a momentum that is hardened by the will to outrun the shadow of the gods. The legacy of the Nile in this chapter is the horror of the geographic disillusionment. We realize that victory was a short distraction and purpose was a tether that Thoth used to anchor the Spartan to the reality of his social value. The purpose of the workshop of the departure was to finalize the solitude, and the fall was the migration of the curse. As the palm trees recede into the golden dust and the god wraps his cloak tighter against the breeze, hearing the crutch of the first frost echoing through the air, they understand that the history of Kratos is the history of the wanderer, a wanderer that leaves the gold of the south to search for the numbness of the north. The final chapter in our 8-part Chronicle of Fallen God records the emotional metamorphosis of the deicidal warrior. This is the narrative frigid redemption, where the physical architecture of the world, the gilded marble of Greece and the ancient sands of Egypt, is shattered by the absolute silence of the Norse wilds. Within the perpetual snow and the whispering pines of Midgard, Kratos finally encounters the end of the road. The lore of this era is the lore of the buried war. Its purpose was the final subjection of the divine identity to the domestic reality. The history of the arrival is the history of the second chance, where the ghost of Sparta discovers that peace is not a place one finds, but a garden one tends through silence and soil. This is the tragedy of the surviving father, proving that hope is a cold seed that requires the blood of the past to insulate the future. The lore of the frozen sanctuary and the numbing of the soul provides the environmental foundation for this final act. By crossing into the north, Kratos seeks the anesthesia of the cold, representing the physical requirement to slow the boiling of his Spartan blood. The lore suggests that Midgard is a geographic purgative. Its purpose was the thermal suppression of the divine rage. By forcing the god to focus on the primal battle for warmth and food, the land attempted to exhaust the demons of Olympus, showing that nature is the only force capable of dampening the spirit of a killer. This reveals the merciful purpose of the frost. The god learns to sleep because the air demands stillness. This was the era of the white grave. The physical environment of the hidden cabin provides insight into the sacred mundanity of the fall. This small, wooden structure represents the total rejection of monumentalism. The lore of the domestic hearth explains that its purpose was the spatial manifestation of the human ambition. By building a home with his own hands, Kratos proved that he has abandoned the architecture of gods for the carpentry of men. This reveals the grounding purpose of the sanctuary. The slayer finds sanity in the rhythm of the axe and the stacking of the wood. This shows that the history of the cabin is a history of the boundary, which keeps the world out and the man in. This was the era of the iron wood. The relationship between the meeting with Laufey and the divine symmetry represents the karmic intersection within the fall. Kratos encounters a woman who challenges him not with power, but with spirit, representing the first being who sees the man before the ghost. The lore suggests that Faye is the architect of the restraint. Its purpose was the demonstration of the strength in vulnerability. By choosing to love a giant in disguise, Kratos proved that his heart was not ash, but soil waiting for rain. This reveals the healing purpose of the union. The warrior discovers that protection is a higher calling than vengeance. This was the era of the Guardian's promise. Furthermore, the lore of the burial of the blades and the floorboard vault represents the psychological interment within the fall. Under the floor of his home, Kratos hides the blades of chaos, representing the ceiling of the Greek tomb. The lore suggests that this act is a living funeral. Its purpose was the conditional erasure of the identity. By refusing to use them and wrapping them in cloth, Kratos proved that he wants to forget the weight of the chains, showing that peace is the daily decision to keep the monster hungry and caged. This reveals the precautionary purpose of the vault. The father builds his life on top of his sins. The relationship between the birth of Atreus and the transfer of the future represents the ontological shift within the fall. The birth of a son who carries the blood of gods and giants forces Kratos to become a teacher of restraint, representing the final step in his deconstruction. The lore suggests that Atreus is the living penance. Its purpose was the eternal monitoring of the Spartan rage. By looking into the eyes of the child, Kratos proved that he must be better than the gods who sired him, showing that legacy is the only force that demands redemption. This reveals the educative purpose of the fatherhood. The ghost becomes a grave, so the son can be a seed. The lore of the final silence of Athena and the victory of the void represents the mental liberation within the narrative. In the deep cold of the north, the voice of the Greek queen finally fades into the breeze, proving that new love is the only exorcism for old hate. The lore suggests that the silence is a victory of presence. Its purpose was the termination of the spectral haunting. By focusing on the needs of his family, Kratos starved the goddess of her influence, showing that the past only lives if the present is empty. This reveals the triumphant purpose of his new life. The god earned the right to be forgotten. The act concludes with the silent observation of Kratos standing outside his cabin as the sun sets over the snowy peaks, realizing that the fallen god has finally landed edition. The purpose of the arrival in Midgard lore was to be the universal exposure of the possibility of transformation. The player realizes that Kratos is no longer a weapon, but a root. The rise of the Father of Midgard is the final movement of the fallen god lore, proving that in the world of God of War, strength is not the will to destroy. It is the will to endure the quiet and nurture the light in the shadow of the blades. The legacy of the migration in this final chapter is the horror of the recursive redemption. We realize that exile was a necessary death and love was a tether that Faye used to anchor the Spartan to the reality of a second chance. The purpose of the workshop of the North was to forge the protector, and the fall was the birth of the father. As the embers of the hearth flicker in the dark, and the god holds the small hand of his son, hearing the whisper of the wind echoing through the valley, they understand that the history of Kratos is the history of the turn, a turn that leaves the blood of the old world behind to seek the peace of the new age.